It's Sunday, January 8, 2023. Welcome to the 46th episode of The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. Please also subscribe to my 5-Minute News daily podcast on iTunes or wherever you get yours. Joining us today is the co-founder and executive director of Partners for Justice, Emily Galvin-Almanza. Emily, welcome to The Weekend Show. Great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
It's been an effort to get you on because you're very busy and you're very popular, and I'm thrilled that we've managed to make this connection here. And just tell us a little bit about Partners for Justice before we start talking about the news.
Absolutely. So, as you know, the scale of the American mass incarceration crisis is substantial. At this point, about half of American families have had a loved one locked up in the criminal legal system. And the people who are often most able to create routes out of that punishment bureaucracy are some of the people most overlooked in the reform conversation. Those are public defenders, because public defenders are automatically assigned to 80% of people in the criminal legal system. They're upstream. They have this unique type of legal protection where they enjoy total confidentiality and an ethical duty to zealously protect and defend each person they're assigned to represent. So what PFJ does is recognize how influential and important public defenders are to restoration and to liberty, but also to all of the other things that the criminal legal system touches: housing, employment, education, healthcare access, benefits access, child custody. And so we try to equip public defenders to protect their clients on all of those fronts instead of just in the criminal legal case. Largely, we do that by augmenting public defender services with sort of case manager, service navigator roles that we call client advocates, who are embedded with defenders to work on all of those different intersecting needs that their clients bring up, that may be drivers of system involvement, they may be side effects of system involvement, but either way, they are the things that are most likely to destroy a person's future and make it impossible for them to move forward after criminal legal system contact. So by working on stabilizing housing, keeping a job, getting access to visit one's kids or retaining child custody, getting kids back in school, getting people signed up for food stamps or medical care, holding someone's hand while they complete substance use or mental health treatment, we can then not only create a better outcome for that person who is standing accused, we can then go back into court and tell the story of all that that person has done and achieved and struggled with and overcome. We can tell that story to judges and prosecutors, which makes it more likely for them to give our clients a restorative outcome instead of an incarceratory outcome. So we've been doing this work for about 5 years. We've grown from 2 locations to about 25, and we estimate that we've eliminated around 4,000 years of incarceration with this work.
It's very impressive. I really think that there will be many Americans who didn't even know that this existed, that there was this kind of support network, and even little things like getting the DMV to, give someone their driver's license back, right? I mean, that enables people to live in society and hold down a job or at least get to a job. And I guess it's those things. You could put all of this under the banner of rehabilitation in a way. It's about living in society with the same rights as the rest of us.
Yeah, it's really about what people of means and privilege are accustomed to when they enter the system. So when you mention the driver's license, for example, without a driver's license in most America is built for cars. I think that's a problem. But in most cities, like, you can't get to work. You can't take your mom to dialysis. You can't drop the kids off at school. You can't get to that job interview that could give you a new opportunity without your car. So what do? Most people will drive illegally because they have a need and they are trying to be a good citizen, a good community member, and they're trying to participate in society. So what that does is create not just a lack of opportunity for people, but also it creates recidivism, right? It creates rearrest. You get picked up for driving on a suspended license, and then you get charged. And if you pick up multiple driving on a suspended license charges, they become more serious. You get buried in the fines and fees associated with that charge. You might even get jail time for that charge. So you take a person who is, by all, other lenses, like doing the right thing, trying to go to jobs or medical appointments or school, and you are perpetually punishing them because you've relegated them to a status where they're not allowed to achieve in the same way as an ordinary person. For a person of means and privilege, they may be able to just pay to get their license back, have their assistant do the paperwork, set it up. So often what we're trying to do is replicate the kind of wraparound care that wealthy people can pay for on behalf of the 80% of people in the legal system who are too poor to afford a lawyer. So really just like leveraging the tools of privilege on behalf of those to whom the tools are frequently denied.
Just quickly, was there an event or story in the news or something in your life that pushed you to create this in the first place, to co-found this organization? Because it sounds to me like you felt the injustice and you needed to do something about it.
Yeah. I will tell you, it's kind of personal. When I was a young person, I had my whole personal and family life kind of go super, super sideways. And I had some very bad years with a lot of law breaking and substance use. And it culminated in me getting arrested. And I got really lucky in multiple ways. First of all, I'm entering the criminal legal system with like all of these privileges, privilege of whiteness, of education, of having a very involved family. I also got really lucky in that I had a judge who was himself a legendary advocate for young people, who looked at me and instead of seeing the risk of me continuing to harm the community, that judge looked at me and saw potential, the potential to go to college and to have a different path. And he took a chance on me and he had my case dismissed and let me, I'd been accepted to college at that time. I got to keep my college acceptance. I got to go to college. I got to go on to law school and ultimately become a public defender because that judge looked at me and saw potential. As a public defender, my first assignment, my first year of law school, I went to the LA County Public Defender's Office for the summer. And I was assigned to East Lake Juvenile, which is the busiest juvenile courthouse in LA, or it was at the time, in East LA. And so I was walking into rooms with these kids who were almost exclusively Black and brown kids, all from very low income families, who had done things that I had done just a few years before. I wasn't that, by the time you go to law school, you're not that much older than your juvenile clients. And where I had been given a chance and where a judge had seen potential, they were being treated as threats and predators and being given punishments and having their whole future destroyed and taken from them in sort of this systematized theft of opportunity, which was enraging. It's, I think, being a public, at least for me, it is far more enraging to do this work having personally experienced the system at its most benevolent, and then watching it be destructive, malevolent, counterproductive, and really actively harmful to communities of color and people who are historically excluded. So I have been really, really angry for about a decade now. My mission became to not just defend people inside the courtroom, but to say, part of my restoration was my continuing education. I got to go to college, right? Well, in Eastlake, I had a kid who was 2 weeks from his high school graduation, who wasn't going to get to graduate because no one had thought to bring him his homework while he was locked up. And it's things like that, right? It's things that seem small, but that are creating a divergence in a person's life path, where if we can take care of the small thing, we can look at this person and say, I know this person is an important member of our community. This person has potential. This person is valuable. I'm going to fight for that person's needs, even if they are small, to ensure that that potential is realized, or at least realizable. As a defender, when I would do that, when I was talking to judges, I would have so much more credibility because I was talking not just about the facts of the case, but also my clients' achievements outside the courtroom. And through that use of detail, a person becomes not just the defendant, but, Johnny, who is excelling inexplicably in his 10th grade English class and who actually really, really, really loves Beowulf. And he's failing math, but we can get him a tutor and work on that. And this is a kid who coaches his little brother's little league team and is really, really involved and great at showing up for people, and who goes to the old folks home and sits with his grandma every Sunday. And once you've heard those details about Johnny, you can no longer see Johnny as the defendant. You no longer see him as the worst thing he may or may not have done. You see him as a person with potential. So I actually ended up practicing at the Bronx Defenders, which is a holistic public defender agency that recognizes the power of this type of defense. And when I was there, I got really frustrated with the fact that that way of practicing is not the norm everywhere. Defenders are not resourced to represent poor people the same way rich people get represented.
Well, often people think that if they're assigned a public defender, then it's going to be a bad brief, effectively, or the
Yes.
A bottom feeder.
Yeah,
is,
a public pretender. A public
right?
pretender.
A public
You hear that?
pretender. and one of my best friends is a public defender here in Los Angeles, and he's one of the most brilliant people I ever met.
Yeah.
And so I'm just very pleased you were able to tell that story to us. And
Yeah.
I'll thank you at the end for your work, but at this point, I also want to thank you. Let's just have a quick look at what happened this week in the news, because it's been a big old week. Firstly, it's the anniversary of the 6th of January on Friday, which is, of course, 2 years since the insurrection. The former disgraced President Donald Trump still hasn't been prosecuted or indicted. That could come at any time. But in the meantime, there's currently no government, effectively. The Republicans won the House, as we know, and as we are talking now, Kevin McCarthy has just lost the 12th vote on the 4th day of voting in the House of Representatives to get the Speaker position. He's already taken Nancy Pelosi's office, as far as I'm aware, but he hasn't yet been given the job. So obviously we'll talk about that and how that affects us. I want to look at the story of Amber McLaughlin, who became the first openly transgender person to be executed in the United States. She died on Tuesday by lethal injection in Missouri, and there's a lot of controversy about that execution. And then finally, the Idaho murder case. Some revelations have come out this week, as well as the court records have been unsealed. And so maybe if we get time, we'll look at that as well. I just want to talk first, before we talk about the fact that this country, as we speak, has no functioning government and no one can get kind of sworn in. Even George Santos can't get sworn in until there's a speaker, although maybe he was the speaker at some point. I think it was on his resume. Anyway,
Probably.
Is that I come from a country that is a social democracy, which is the United Kingdom. So we have, until very recently, you could get a public defender, a free legal advisor or solicitor or lawyer and they actually changed the law on that about 10 years ago. So you have to have committed like a certain crime to get somebody, just cutting back on costs. And that was a real tragedy for the criminal justice system in the UK. However, we do have free welfare. So if you don't have a job, you'll be paid and your rent will be paid and your kind of bills will be paid and all that stuff. And we call that unemployment benefit, and that's just normal. That's just been around since forever. And we also have free healthcare. So no matter who you are, even if you're homeless, you can go into any hospital. Even you from the United States can come to England and use any hospital for free. I mean, it's kind of amazing. And so I'm a big advocate of that kind of system where you look after people no matter what their social status or standing or, how much money they have in the bank. And then I moved to the United States like 6 years ago, and I was like, wow, just like reading on Nextdoor, the community site about how much people hate the homeless. Can't we get rid of these people? Like the language that's used is so, they don't even call them people. They refer to them as like vermin. And then, of course, the language that's used about immigrants and, criminals, rapists, just like to describe families. It's just really cruel. And that cruelty is something I've always been very interested in. Now, obviously, it's not everybody, and I don't want to kind of, say the US is a cruel country. I don't believe it is, but half of it could be, right? And this is what I'm interested in. When did the US become so cruel? Has it always been this way? And is there you're fighting against a system that is fundamentally uncivilized?
There's some deep Irish ancestry in me that wants to bring up Cromwell, but I'm not going to do it.
Go for it. Big fan.
I do think the U.S. has always been this cruel. I mean, you have to remember this is a nation founded as a slaver nation. This is a nation whose prosperity was built by people kidnapped from their homes and enslaved. So to say that the U.S. has taken a sudden turn is hard, because throughout our history is brief, or at least the history of our colonizer nation is brief. It's only a couple hundred years. Yours is much, much, much longer. But it's been one of tumult and division and dehumanization and violence and cruelty and bloodthirst and manifest destiny and conquest. It's a nation made up entirely of immigrants who hates immigrants, except for, Native peoples, First Nations living here, who are themselves still to this day oppressed in ways that I think most white people aren't aware of. It's a nation that often doesn't know itself and its own history, and I think that's really a huge part of it. So you have to remember, America in its greatest years was a nation that aspired to realize ideals, that aspired to be a beacon of hope for people oppressed across the world. That beautiful Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty, sending me, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. It's a nation that has tried to conceive of warfare as ideological, whether legitimately or not. All of those periods are times when we had our strongest public education system. Our public healthcare system is non-existent. We don't have one. You're right. If you get sick in America, that is on you. It's a crime to have diabetes. You're going to be bankrupt and die.
Well, there isn't really a healthcare system here. There is healthcare, but there is no system.
No,
we saw that in COVID.
There's an insurance racket, but no, we don't have a publicly available healthcare system. But I would say that when our public education system has been great, and when we raised children who knew our history and who could conceive of this as a nation where possibility and change is welcomed, right? Where when we conceive of the American dream as the idea that anyone can come here and have a great idea and use their brilliance to shape the future of the nation and our role in the world, and specifically to shape the future of a nation that has great power on the world stage, that is America at its best. That America does not exist without robust public education. And I feel like in so many places, what we see is a system of public education that has been deliberately dismantled to create a citizenry who do not know their history and who do not feel that sense of possibility that relies on embracing change and embracing difference and learning more about the other, that relies on curiosity. Instead, we have limited systems of information that really are designed to amplify fear and division and make people easier to control. So until we get better public schools in every state, I think we're going to continue seeing American extremism.
I just want to caveat what I said about the UK, because, of course, we were responsible for much of the slavery. In fact, you could argue we started it. And really, things didn't get as good or as essential as they are now, as in the welfare and the National Health Service, until after the Second World War, around 1945-46 is when the NHS was created. I think, war in Europe was very different to war in the US, because obviously it was on the mainland here in the UK, and, the bombers were overhead, and unless you lived in Hawaii, that wasn't really happening for you in the US. And so that brought people together. And the tragedy of war is that it does bring people together. It breaks down those social and racial barriers when you become the kind of common allied force. And we're seeing that a little bit in Ukraine at the moment. But the US, because it wasn't participating in the war in that way, even though in the history books, as I've noticed here, I even heard Kevin McCarthy say it once in Congress, the Brits were losing and we went over there and we won the war for them. And I was like, well, that's not how I learned it. And so there is this kind of revisionist history, isn't there, about this kind of idea that America is this superpower Do you think there was a point at which things changed? Was it, maybe after the civil rights movement of the 1960s or late 50s and 60s, where there was like a perfect moment where, the space race was happening, everybody felt good, there was money around, or because that's how I identify it in the UK, like 1946, maybe that's when people started to kind of start thinking differently. Is there a point in recent US history where you think this was like an ideal time? Because a lot of Republicans want to get back to that, make America white again. I guess that was the period in which they put on a pedestal.
Yeah, it's easy to idealize the 1950s if you're a white man, head of household. Right. You can just sort of ignore, a bunch of women who've been relegated exclusively to the home and like an alternating like Dexedrine and Valium situation and like all of Jim Crow. You can just set that aside. I think every moment in history is fraught. I think that our moments of greatest triumph tend to be paired again with great invention and innovation. I think part of what made the space race so exciting was not the idea of American exceptionalism, but exceptional achievements by Americans and by immigrants, actually, in many ways during the war and thereafter, that showed us quite concretely what an explosive force of creative intellect could do. I think that's really important. You have to remember that, not long after World War II, we were drawn into Vietnam. On a historical time frame, it was a blink of an eye between World War II and Vietnam. Talk about a non-unifying war, a war that created unbelievable lasting trauma and division to our population. I mean, I still, as a public defender, I can't tell you how many Vietnam vet clients I've had. It was a war whose atrocities created psychic scars in our nation that manifest to this day as ongoing mental health crises and crises of lack of housing and, cycles of arrest and rearrest. You also have to understand that our policing has always been massively more violent than European or UK policing. Your bobbies still don't have guns, right? This looks like they got like nightsticks, right?
They have a baton that extends to about 16 inches.
Yeah, our police have tanks. Yeah. Actually, I remember
I've seen those. Yeah,
I was mentoring.
They have military equipment, basically.
There's actually a program through which the military can give its unused equipment to local police forces. I remember I was mentoring a kid when I was in law school. I was mentoring a high school kid in East Palo Alto, and he told me that his local cops had a tank, and I was like, maybe they have like a big armored. It's not a tank. Couldn't be. No, they have a tank. They would drive a tank through his neighborhood. So I think the relationship that one has to one's government and what is the government? Is it a system that provides you with benefits like a social safety net and healthcare and unemployment? Or does it largely manifest in your community as armed agents who have killed almost 2,000 people this year alone, but whose history of violence towards primarily marginalized people is like as old as our country? I think that creates a really different national response to what government is and how we relate to it.
But things are changing. I mean, even the fact that as we speak, there is no functioning government in the United States, I mean, is proof that there is a shift. Now, it's unfortunate that it's kind of, extremists that are causing these problems. But, there is very little moderation in right-wing Republican politics as it stands. There is this very extreme view that all immigrants are bad. And I guess it was Trump that created that mantra. I'm sure it existed before, but there was very much Trump that pushed home that mantra that if you were arriving via the southern border, then you were a baddie.
Yeah.
And that is, it's very problematic for a country that was, built by slaves and immigrants for a start.
And whose entire purpose is not whose entire purpose, but who a fundamental part of the identity of America and its role in the world is as a place of refuge and a place of opportunity. Literally, like that, the American dream is deeply integrated with refuge and opportunity. What's weird is you're right that on the national stage, things have absolutely changed. And I think that with substantial portions of our population, their ideology has shifted to a far more extremist and dehumanizing view. I mean, I still have conservative friends who I talk to who do not reflect the views of their party, but who still vote for people whose ideology is an ideology of hate. I use friend in a longing way because I have real serious issues with what it takes to support someone whose position on taxation you like, but who thinks that my family is illegitimate because we are mixed race and
But isn't that the problem, though, that it's very black and white here? It's very compartmentalized. And the world is nuanced and society is nuanced. And there doesn't seem to be, maybe this goes back to education, or even the lack of travel. Only half of Americans have a passport that they've ever used, right? Because you only have to move around the world, you can do it on YouTube these days. You don't have to go very far from your living room to kind of see how other countries operate. But it's this desire to be inquisitive, and it's the lack of interest, maybe, because so many Americans are told that they are born into the greatest country in the world. And it just isn't. I mean, maybe it was briefly, and it definitely can be again. But you don't have to travel far in Europe to see some systems that are operating in the most beautiful fashion. Mm-hmm. You look at Norway or look at Sweden or any of these countries. They have their problems, but they recognize that all people are fundamentally the same, and we're not all born with great brains or access to finances. We're not all born with the same skills to be able to make a living on our own. And that's nobody's fault. We're all the same race. And yet the US does not subscribe to that. It's got this kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you're not out there and working all hours, you only get 2 weeks holiday in the United States. In these really Scandinavian countries, they finish work at 3 p.m., and it's like, let's go back to our families.
So you're right that the lack of contact with other countries, lack of linguistic ability, lack of travel, definitely results in a populace that isn't aware of kind of how good it could be in other places. But I also think that a lot of what you're talking about is rooted in fear, right?
Yeah.
That sort of America first, I want America to be protected for me and for my needs and for what I want is rooted in a fear of something being taken away, a fear of being excluded, harmed, marginalized, unhealthy. It's funny that a lot of the things that are so intrinsic to our current dysfunctional system are the things that drive the fear that makes people embrace that same system. I'm afraid of being sick and poor and alone, so I'm going to vote for people who take away health care and take.
But none of that is true. And this is what upsets me so much, is that really I don't believe there is a huge difference between the left and the right if you interview people on an individual basis. But this tribalism makes people jump into one camp or the other. No one is going to take your health care away, even if Bernie Sanders got his way and enabled there to be, Medicare for all.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you can't also have private health insurance that works really well. It's not one thing or the other. And that message was muddied. So do you think Democrats maybe are just not good enough at the messaging?
Well, the social media machine is really hard. So I remember when I was a kid, I'm an elder millennial. I grew up before the internet, and then we got the internet. And I had a lot of grownups telling me not to believe things that I read on the internet and to be careful of what people tell you on the internet. And a lot of those same grownups then are now in a world where they read something on the internet and think that it must be true or it wouldn't be on the internet. I think that the disinformation capabilities available in our modern world and, tools that special interests can use to make people believe things are other than they are. Obama's going to take your doctor away. Bernie Sanders is going to take your doctor away. Microchips in COVID vaccines. Even on an individual basis, there are people who have been led to believe really extreme things and who genuinely believe them. And that wasn't possible in a world where people were getting their news from the nightly news.
So where's the barometer for truth gone? I mean, is it that we need Walter Cronkite to give us that kind of line, that's kind of line in the sand to say, okay, this is factual. Now go off and do whatever you think. Is it the media and social media that has caused people to be so lost because there's just too much information? It's too chaotic.
I don't think we're going to get back to a Walter Cronkite, because to be there, you have to be in a world where people of all different political backgrounds can trust the same person. And at this point, you're right. The ship has sailed. Tribalism is rampant. To get someone back to believing, that there is a source of truth that is mainstream and shared with many, many people of very different backgrounds and beliefs, I don't know that we can get back there. I do think that, I'm going to come back to public education. So much of what's possible is possible because people don't know how to site check. They don't know how to be skeptical of sources. I mean, most of the disinfo I've seen out there can be easily discovered with like a simple Google search. Is this true? No, it's clearly not true. But I think when you undermine people's ability to evaluate information in a way that is skeptical and somewhat more refined, you make them susceptible to this. And I mean, you have to remember, you Google any stats about American education, staggering numbers of people cannot find certain countries on a map, we are living in a nation that has been deprived of the opportunity of a real education in many, many regions.
Just sticking with education for a minute, there is this kind of driver that outside of what is a good or a bad education, there is also this kind of misinformation within education now. I'm talking about claiming that there's some kind of critical race theory in classes, and that, kids learning about transgenderism is going to make them want to transition. I mean, that there is just such little understanding of the science, even the science, I mean, let alone the cultural explanations. There is a scientific explanation with a lot of these things. Yeah. And plenty of people have written about, about racism and how education is like the only way out of this. And yet, so clearly from the Republicans' perspective, they must know that there isn't CRT in regular schools, that it's a module in certain universities, but they recognize that they can score points, they can further divide people, they can frighten people, and so that's why they're using it. I mean, this serves nobody, does it? And yet it doesn't seem to be going away. If anything, it's increasing. Yeah,
it certainly doesn't serve ordinary people. It serves powerful interests that want to retain power. I think that what you really see, especially with the CRT debate, is a desire to maintain one's ability to promulgate revisionist history, right? When you've classified any discussion of race in America, which, by the way, big topic here, see our history, slavery, all, you can't discuss the history of America without discussing race. It's fundamentally impossible. To force a discussion of history without a discussion of race is to impose a mandate on teachers to deliver revisionist history. And so I think it's not just a scare tactic. It's not just a mechanism to roil the base, which it certainly has been. It's also the means to justify and perpetuate, a form of revisionist history and social control. One thing that I also think is really informative is, so in my line of work, in the criminal legal system, suicidality is real in our sector. Our punishment system is brutal. It is violent. The conditions inside American prisons and jails are, everybody got really upset about Brittany Griner being in a Russian gulag, and a lot of the conditions that they were upset about in the Russian context are conditions that are completely real in American jails today, right now, as we are having this conversation. So we have to talk oftentimes about suicidality. We have clients who are experiencing suicidal ideation. We have to be able to raise it and have a sensitive and nuanced conversation so that we understand where people are and how they're doing, and we can find the means to keep them safe. The primary reason most folks in my line of work are scared to talk about suicidality is they're scared that if you talk with someone about suicide, that person will be more likely to die by suicide.
Right.
which is not in any way the case. In fact, having the conversation is a necessary path towards safety. And yet even I know this intellectually. I have read the research. I've been taught, I've taken courses on this. I still feel that fear inside myself of, oh God, if we talk about this, am I going to say something wrong that hurts this other person? And I think what we see, especially in the sort of transgender aspect of this conversation, is a leveraged fear. A leveraged fear that to speak something is to manifest it, to impose it on the interlocutor. That unifying of education and conversation with influence and control, which are not necessarily connected. Those two things have to be deliberately connected. So again, if more Americans were better educated in the first place, we would understand that learning about something and exploring it with your mind makes you less likely to be controlled by other people within that realm of subject matter. But if you don't know that, it can feel really scary because you naturally connect, I think, information delivery with influence delivery.
There is a counter-argument that Republicans put forward. It's not my counter-argument. Don't shoot the messenger. But that is that if we are talking about race all the time, that means we're racist. And if we don't talk about it, and if we don't educate this, or put it into education, then you can't say we're racist because we don't, they say their phrase is we don't see color. And yet black and brown people have been crying out to be seen for centuries. This is the kind of misnomer, isn't it? That not talking. This is their argument, I guess, how they would intellectualize it. It's like, well, if I don't talk about it, therefore I'm not a racist. Yeah,
you could be blue, green, or purple. Yeah, they love to talk about purple people. No, I think it's a really important thing to raise because, again, it comes down to people kind of not knowing what they're missing. Look at it this way. When I think about conservative folks who I grew up with in rural America, I think most of them would very much want to know about the research that shows that there's just as much crime happening in some wealthy white neighborhoods as in hyper-policed black and brown low-income neighborhoods. The reason we see more people being arrested from those black and brown neighborhoods is because more police are sent there. And police, you can go on for hours about different police policies that increase rates of arrest in low-income neighborhoods and that reward police for higher rates of arrest on folks who are in many ways easier targets, who are more available to be arrested. That results, in an overrepresentation of low-income, primarily black men in our legal system, a system in which over 80%, and I want to quote you I want to get it right, but it's over 80% of the people working as legal professionals in that system are white. So you've got an influx of system users who are primarily black men, judges, prosecutors, and defense lawyers who are primarily white, and all of the research on implicit bias and how humans relate differently to humans who don't look like them. Then you have, sort of the interlocking media narratives, the super predator ideology of the sort of Clinton era, and scare tactics, propaganda, tough on crime policy messaging that people are steeped in. I think if I spoke to, and I have spoken with friends of mine back home who have never thought about this stuff in their life because they grew up in a primarily white community, this is not relevant to their immediate lived experience, and nobody ever told them this stuff. And you know what? They do, at the end of a conversation like this, want to know more about how systems disproportionately hurt black and brown people. I think where you get that defensiveness is, if I go into this conversation about race, you're going to call me racist because I'm white and I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
So I feel like if we could, it's not really about anybody doing a better job, but breaking down the mechanisms of prevention that prevent that conversation from happening more easily is really crucial to making people more able to engage the conversation without fear and defensiveness and anger.
I reported a story this week on 5 Minute News about the LAPD, who in their quest to kind of learn more about racial profiling, they've been looking at the numbers, and they said that black people are 2.5 times more likely to be stopped and searched. But the final line that I wrote in this piece was that statistically, it was more white people committing crimes. So even though they were making these arrests or stopping and searching black and brown people, they were being released without charge at far greater rates than white people who were being stopped and searched. And yet statistically, it doesn't play well in the media, so it doesn't get reported.
Right. No, I think it was one of those big stop and frisk studies that showed that white people were more likely to actually have contraband when they were searched. Yeah. I feel like data-oriented studies like this, right? Like if you want a big newspaper to run a story on more black people are getting searched, but it's white people who actually have contraband, it's very challenging. They do try, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Marshall Project, does this brilliantly. The Appeal did it really well. There's a lot of outlets who are trying to push back and do a better job of reporting that illuminates structural bias instead of burying it under waves of propaganda. I think what's hard is that, again, people select which media they engage with. What's weird is actually the January 6th, the arrests of people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th, and they're being held on bail or not held on bail, like that actually did more to bring ordinary conservatives who had never thought about bail as an issue into the conversation about our criminal legal system, because suddenly it was really visible to them how unfair it is that a person might be accused of a crime, still legally innocent, and taken out of their job, their life, separated from their family, and held in a very violent space based on an accusation alone, when we really don't have much reason to believe this person won't come back to court voluntarily. So it's opened up kind of exciting conversations about these issues.
The January 6th argument from the right is that the BLM protests of the previous summer were just as bad, and they, if not worse, right? That's their argument. They show photographs of shops being burned, and this is what, white privileged people fail to understand, is that if things have to get so bad that you need to burn your own local store to be heard, to feel that you are kind of raising your hand and saying, please notice me, please help, please do something about it, that you would burn your own town, your own city. And obviously there's controversy about who actually, sets these things on fire, and there's all that stuff as well. And that, the daytime peaceful protest, which involves children and families, is not necessarily the same as the nighttime protest. But that's not the point. The point is that, and we had this, in the LA riots years ago, it's the same thing. It's a cry for help. And obviously slavery still exists. It's just happening inside federal prisons,
and state.
And state prisons, and people incarcerated and paid. And here in LA County, they make inmates fight fires. I mean, it's like, really? This stuff is not getting enough coverage. There's not enough debate. There's very few town squares to have these debates now, where people, regular people, get to voice their views. They mainly do it under the kind of safety net of Facebook, although safety in Facebook is kind of an ironic sentence. I mean, when is America going to start having kind of open, honest conversations about what's really happening? Or is everyone just going to carry on pretending that the kind of picket fence and the Chevy in the driveway is that kind of
we're going to keep clinging to that. We're going to that's our thing.
That's my question, Emily.
I think that there are certain policy changes which would actually do a lot of good. Look, I don't think that we will organically find our way into a state of greater national unity and greater willingness to engage the realities of our present moment. But I do think that there are key policy changes which, if implemented, could have an outsized influence on where we stand as a nation and the types of decisions we make for our future. One thing, and I know this is a niche subject, but felon disenfranchisement In the US, when you're convicted of a felony in all but 2 states, you are to some level deprived in the future of your right to vote. So, and it can be in perpetuity. When you apply the lens of how disproportionately targeting Black men our system is, you have a large-scale deprivation of the right to vote for Black people in America. The stats on
Which is, again, Republicans cheating.
Well, yeah, sure, but it's not a new thing. So historically, we do this this form of disenfranchisement, which I think I don't want to say that Democrats are absolved of this. There are plenty of Democrats.
Because with the gerrymandering and the redistricting and all that goes on the Democrat side as well. But ultimately, this is just about getting more or fewer Democrat votes, which is the only way Republicans can win. Yeah. And even if they have to do that through preventing incarcerated people from voting, then that's what they're going to do.
There are plenty of Democrats who also wouldn't support. I mean, Bernie Sanders is the only person I've heard come out in favor of full enfranchisement. And what's silly about this, and this goes again to people in power reacting to things based on emotion rather than based on facts. When you look at the data, we see a pattern. Forms of community connection are really, really great for preventing crime. When you lock somebody up, and again, 40% of American families have had a loved one locked up at this point. Over 95% of people who've been locked up come home. So basically, we can assume pretty much everybody who gets locked up is coming home. When people come home, if they are integrated into their society, if they have the means to secure housing, employment, access to mental health or substance use care if they need it, those are the 3 most important factors for safety, for whether that person lives, their life without getting arrested again in the future. What is deeply entwined with that, though, is social connection. How do most people get jobs? Well, some people cold call, they show up for an app, they land the job cold. Many, many, many people use social networks and social integration in order to achieve housing and employment and education. You call your brother, he knows a guy who's hiring right now, or you stay with your cousin who can let you stay on the couch for this many days till you find an apartment, or your aunt can loan you the money for the down payment on your rental, etc. When you cut people off from those forms of social integration, you make it much harder for them to survive without engaging in crime. So when you put them in a prison that's very far away from their home community, and when you make visiting really difficult, and when you make phone calls cost an exorbitant amount, thanks FCC for now cracking down on that, you're cutting off people from the means to do well. Cutting people off from voting, weirdly, is in this category. There's a few studies talking about the right to vote and that feeling of integration into the community, of being a member, of civic participation, of having a voice, as being itself ameliorative and lowering recidivism. So what's interesting to me is if we wanted a nation that was healthy and safe and full of economic mobility and the American dream, politicians, including Democrats, would probably be doing things urgently to help ensure that folks have access to housing, income, care if they need it, mental health, substance use especially, and also forms of civic integration and participation like voting. So when I hear a Democrat say well, I don't know, certain felonies, you should just never have a political voice again, what I'm hearing is, I don't really know much about what creates public safety, but I'm going to say this thing that sounds like it fits with history, which is not good either.
I agree. I mean, I don't get to vote, and I would love to be able to vote. I get to talk about it, but I don't get to do it. But I recognize that your fundamental, basic democratic right is the vote. Mm-hmm. No matter your race or gender, it's essential. And yeah, I mean, it would be surprising to see how helpful it would be to rehabilitation.
There's several pieces, really well written pieces of research and thought leadership on this. I can tell you just, anecdotally, I have a friend who was living in a state where he could not vote because of his record. And he recently moved to a state where he could. And the giddy excitement. The only other person I've seen that excited to go to a voting booth is my 5-year-old who loves going to voting booths. But, it's meaningful to people. It also creates a different definition for politicians of who is the base, right? When you exclude people who you've already marginalized from having a voice, you exclude them from your base. And then you amplify it with, as you mentioned, prison gerrymandering, where we count the population of a jurisdiction, including its non-voting prisoners. You're liberating politicians from having to make decisions that reflect the interests of entire categories of people. So it's really, doubling, tripling the marginalization that's already in place.
Let's bring some of these subjects together and look at the Amber McLaughlin story, who became the first openly transgender person to be executed in the US. On Tuesday, she died by lethal injection. The controversy is criminal justice reform advocates decrying the circumstances of her sentencing. She committed a crime in 2006. It was first-degree murder, the killing of her ex-girlfriend. And the jury failed to reach an agreement on a punishment, rejecting 3 out of the 4 aggravating circumstances presented by prosecutors that would legally justify a death sentence. And despite the hung jury, it was a trial judge that sentenced McLaughlin to death. And this really is where the controversy lies, is that a solitary person, a guy, a man, got to choose whether this person lived or died. Just tell us how, with your job and your expertise, why this is so important.
So first of all, it's highly unusual in our legal system for one person to be the decider of life or death for another person. Although in the appellate context on appeals, that does happen. But normally, let's back up. The death penalty is a wildly problematic response to wrongdoing because our system so often gets it wrong. I think close to 200 people have been liberated from death row at this point because of findings of actual innocence. So there are substantial numbers of factually innocent people awaiting execution in this country. Clearly, the safeguard... We
should also just caveat that there are so many countries that don't kill people anymore.
Yes, there's a lot of countries where the government just doesn't kill people.
Where I'm from, we don't put people to death.
It's not necessary to kill people. No. And there's a whole other conversation to be had actually about, and this is another instance of emotion driving American policy instead of facts. Yeah. What actually is deterrent in terms of crime is a high certainty of a limited punishment. Right. Very, very extreme punishments like the death penalty or life in prison, which is another form of, death by incarceration, or very, very long sentences, don't actually have any deterrent effect. So we're not gaining anything in terms of public safety by utilizing these extreme sentences. It is purely emotional. It is an eye for an eye. It is that feeling of retributive vengeance. And we get it wrong a lot. I personally think it's wrong we'll go over it, but we get guilt wrong a lot, in spite of the safeguards that the system has in place. For example, the jury system, in which, 12 people are supposed to unanimously decide that they believe this person is guilty. The death penalty context is already set up for bias, not only because of the long history of Black and brown people and people with lived experience in the system being excluded from juries, but also because to get a death sentence, a prosecutor usually needs what's called a death qualified jury. In other words, isn't that a horrible term? A death qualified jury. So what that means is when you pick a jury of people to decide guilt or innocence and then a sentence in the case, if it's going to be a death case, you have to only pick people who are okay with the death penalty. So that already is a self-selecting group of people who are substantially more punitive than your average bear, people who are willing to let their government kill people on the basis of a finding of guilt. So already you've got folks in the room who are more likely to convict, more likely to be comfortable imposing the death penalty. The fact that in this case, the jury did not impose the death penalty and a judge overrode that to take it upon himself to cause the death of this human being is itself astonishing. But I want to go back for 1 second to when we talk about innocence, because this is not an innocence case. This is a case where the person we're talking about had lived through hell, had been horribly abused as a kid.
Her stepfather would rub feces into her and electric shock treatment.
And use the nightstick and the taser on her. This is a person who had tested with a limited IQ at various times when being tested. So when we talk about guilt, I guess the question I'm asking is, if a person has been so horribly traumatized and is in a time in their life when they may be experiencing unbearable psychological torment, severe depression. If this person is not well at the time when they engage in their act of harm, how is it just as a society to take that person's life based on an act they may have done in a condition that made it harder for them to control their behavior? Am I saying people should be allowed to go kill people willy-nilly because they were abused as a kid? No. But I am saying that a system that focuses on restoration and preventing future harm is not a system that would ever have the death penalty or death by incarceration in any form.
How is it even possible to get close to that when people want immigrants dead for just crossing a border, seeking asylum, or want homeless people dead for sleeping on the street, trying to stay warm in a doorway? I mean, it's quite an ask of the American people that choose to be so uncivilized, because often these people are also the ones with, living in states that have open carry and are very proud of their weapons, that call themselves patriots. There is this huge divide between just understanding goodness, kindness, wanting to give everybody a chance, and being someone who is a public executioner, walking the streets, walking around Walmart and just living their lives. I mean, just open carry demonstrates the fact that you are prepared to be a public executioner. Derek Chauvin thought he could get away with murdering George Floyd in public, in daylight, whilst being filmed. He knew he would get away with it because the political appetite at the time was that the police had to be protected at all costs and the police know best. I mean, just the culture must make your job very, very difficult.
There's an expression, you might call somebody all hat and no cattle. When they make a big...
We say all fur coat and no knickers.
Yeah.
I think I understand
Oh, that's way more fun.
Yeah. You can use that.
I don't think most Americans are ready to be public executioners. I do. I mean, the Kyle Rittenhouse case is terrifying. Derek Chauvin, terrifying. But just as I believe in the great potential of people who stand accused of crimes, I extend that belief and that grace to people open carrying in Walmart, to everyone. Yeah. And I think that when you poll people on these issues in ways that ensure they are informed of the background, I think if you asked most Americans, a person who was horribly abused as a child and experiencing a mental health crisis at the time they committed murder, was not sentenced to death by their jury, but a single judge overrode the jury and sentenced them to death anyway, do you think that person should die? I think most Americans of all political backgrounds would say no. I think if you... So
detail is the solution. We're always light on detail. Yeah. And actually, when you throw kind of more situational awareness into the mix, that kind of human instinct for kindness, which I believe we're all born with, comes to the surface.
It's really hard to hurt people when you know their story. And I also think the same thing is true of border policy. I think that the reason our system uses so much dehumanizing language, why would you ever call another person an illegal? Well, it's to make them not feel like a person when you talk about them.
I hate that one.
The same is true. I mean, the entire criminal legal system is built on sanitizing and dehumanizing language. There's the dehumanizing pejorative, a felon, an addict, a perpetrator, an offender. Then there's the sanitizing language that covers up how much harm we do to other people. We're not putting this young mother into a fetid cage. We are sentencing the defendant to custody, perhaps even protective custody. Police didn't violently arrest this person. They picked them up. They got picked up by police. A search warrant was duly executed. Really? Armed people in helmets broke down someone's door at 5 a.m. So we've constructed a world in which everyone who works within the system is protected from feeling the full weight of what they're doing by the very words they use. The judge isn't called by their name. They are the court. The court is sentencing the offender to a term of years, as opposed to myself, I'm looking at another human being and I'm sending them away from their family for a decade. Like that. It matters. It seems small, but it enables a great deal of harm.
Finally, let's look at the Idaho murders story. This is after these revelations have come out this week after the court records have been unsealed. This is the murders of 4 University of Idaho students in a house near the campus. The authorities released their most detailed account yet of the investigation that led them to arrest a criminology student from a nearby university. Tell us why this is so interesting to you.
So it's interesting to me because I love watching the media follow a play-by-play of the normal processes, the normal working of our system, in a way that blows truth totally out of the water. Like I remember just yesterday I saw a report, accused, Idaho killer says he's not mentally ill. Well, actually, he was not contesting extradition. He was allowing himself to be brought back to the state where he's accused. And in the course of engaging in that, what we call a colloquy on the record, the required dialogue with the judge, you have to ask if you have to say whether you're currently experiencing any mental health condition that would make you unable to make this choice. And he said no. So it's like this totally normal thing that the media just grabs and is like, he says it. So there's a lot of hysteria here. But to me, that's sort of a synecdoche of a larger issue, which is that when we think about crime in America, we think about bad guy. We think about the scary, when I say that guy, I mean the person described. I don't necessarily mean the person accused. He hasn't been found guilty. I don't know what the full extent of this investigation is going to reveal. But when Americans think about crime, they think about home invasion. They think about a person wearing a black mask coming into your house at night with a knife. They think about the scariest things. And what's really damaging about that is that these very scary things are extraordinarily rare. 80% of cases in the criminal legal system are misdemeanors. So things that aren't even considered serious enough to warrant prison time. They're jail offenses. They can have an outside, negative impact on a person's life, sure. But 80% of what's in the criminal legal system is misdemeanors. When you look at that other 20% that are classified as felonies, a huge quantity of it is drug sales, burglaries of unoccupied structures, various repeat driving offenses, fistfights, carrying weapons that didn't get used. So there's like this whole body of serious crime that is not what keeps people up at night. I can tell you, as a public defender, I've represented about 2,000 people. I have never met someone who was that boogeyman. I've met people who made some bad choices. I've met people who did something, scary, almost always when drunk, high, or experiencing a mental health crisis. But when the media focuses on the boogeyman like this, we get downstream from that, knee-jerk, tough on crime, lock them up, throw away the key, execute them policies that are everybody's emotional response to the very scary crime, when in fact, the actual crimes that happen in America are not crimes any normal American would react that way to. It's skewing our whole picture of reality, and I think that's really dangerous.
And the media obviously plays a big part because a little bit like healthcare, the media is for profit. And, it knows that if I was reading about, the picture that gets chosen. They choose a certain picture of the suspect looking like they are, just that they've picked the worst photo they can. So they look like a baddie. And obviously that is very unhelpful in terms of securing a kind of just prosecution or otherwise.
Yeah.
So there is this intrinsic bias in media where they're just trying to build audience. And I don't think people really understand that. That's part of living in this kind of, false environment, this parallel universe that is controlled by the media.
If it bleeds, it leads. Yeah. Right? That's historic. That's dates back to the time of, newspapers for sale, little paper boys on the street, competing for which paper could get the goriest details under their front page and sell more papers. I would also note that this, like everything else in the U.S., comes with its own baked-in racial bias. So often, when you have an accused person of privilege, you get the cute photo of them at their high school graduation, and then for anyone of color, it's mugshot immediately. So regardless of guilt, this is people who are still legally innocent. Obviously, that's a huge issue, but yeah, the media needs to amplify the boogeyman story because it allows for more content, right? Every stage, if you Google this story, you're going to see stories that came out 2 hours ago, 4 hours ago, 6 hours ago. Every couple of hours, there's a new angle. He said this, he did that. They're transferring him here. This is, somebody saw a car at this time and place. It's a content generation machine. And when done in a way that doesn't educate the public about how rare this is, it's as if all of your health reporting focused on a disease that impacts 3 people globally every year, as if it's a new pandemic. That would be really irresponsible health journalism. It doesn't happen in the health context. Why do we see it in the crime context?
I just want to finish with a little optimism because, I am an optimistic person and people write to me and they say, can you offer some more solutions on this show? Because, you highlight obviously the issues, but how do we find solutions? I mean, I would say Kevin McCarthy, as we're talking now, has just lost his 13th vote. Things are changing so rapidly. Yeah. Donald Trump has lost his last 3 votes as to try and win back his premiership. A whole bunch of candidates, extremist candidates that he supported, lost in the midterms. Around the world, I would say with Jair Bolsonaro losing in Brazil, that has had a knock-on effect in other countries as well, that there are fewer populists being voted for. And so there is starting to be a bit of a shift to what I believe is normality. Americans like to call it progressive, but it isn't progressive to want people to be given the opportunity to live in a civilized society with everybody else. Where do you see, just finally, where do you see the kind of the shining lights, the light at the end of the tunnel for the American criminal justice system and for the country as a whole?
I've been really encouraged in recent years because when I started doing my work, which is trying to expand public defense so as to make up for a lot of the inherent harm of, bias of, deficits of our system, I was not prepared. I was in a world where most legislators think of prosecutors as Batman and defenders as the Joker. And so I was going around trying to say, the Joker has real value. And that's a challenge. That's challenging messaging. But in fact, we're in a time when there has been a really wonderful investment in research in our sector, in what creates safety. If you actually go on the Partners for Justice website, in our stories section at the bottom, we have a bunch of documents tagged as research, which assemble all of the studies about how housing influences safety, how economic mobility influences safety, et cetera, et cetera. So when I'm in conversations with lawmakers, I've been actually getting traction, having lawmakers realize that when they invest in public defense, they are investing in a resource that can be massively beneficial to their community, not just on the criminal justice front, but in the healthcare and safety and economic mobility front as well. And getting people interested in that idea is promising because it's getting lawmakers interested in care over cages. We're a cages country. We've always been a cages country. The burgeoning interest in more restorative responses to harm is important in criminal justice, yes, but it's also going to be important in climate, in economic policy, in healthcare policy. It's all a form of saying, yes, we should invest in people's well-being as opposed to reacting ex post facto to crises and harm. So that to me is a trend that I'm seeing on the local level and on a state level that gives me a great deal of hope. I also think that there is a fatigue in our current state of division. I don't necessarily know what the path out of it is. But I do feel as though people are exhausted with the news cycle of crisis, division, extremism, hate. And I hope that with that exhaustion comes a willingness to become more curious about other ideas in the rest of the world. So those are my two pieces of hope, I suppose.
Thank you. And you, as an individual, are proof that it works, right? That with your background and your story and the good work that you do now, the work that you do now is testament to your story. And if you hadn't have struggled early on, you might not have had the fight in you to be the person you are today. And I guess Partners for Justice and the people that you have served are the better for it. And so maybe we should never regret our past if it forges our future.
There's a lot of things I wouldn't understand today, and a lot of forms of what I hope is credibility that I can carry because of some of the worst moments of my life. And I'm a tiny example of that. I know so many people who are out there doing brilliant things. Kenyatta Leal with The Next Chapter, Jason Wang with Free World, Josh Ho and his podcast. Like, there are so many people who have lived experience that they are channeling into changing the world. I actually just read a story today of a guy who has a record. He's been out of prison, I think, 15 years. And he's been doing really well. And he went to law school and he landed a clerkship with the Supreme Court of, I believe it's Michigan. And one judge was so offended by his record that judge managed to force the judge this guy was clerking for to, I don't know, the guy resigned. He didn't get to do his clerkship because of something that happened over a decade ago. I want his insight when he looks at cases. It's not about checking a box of like, oh, we need diversity. We need a person with lived experience in this job. No. It's about recognizing that sometimes people who've been through hell learn a lot in going through hell. And we want those insights and that knowledge in the decision-making space. So yeah, I'm a tiny example, but generally I think that it's wrong to value lived experience as, diversity box checking. It's right to recognize that it can be a superpower.
Okay. Thank you for your expertise and for your empathy and for the work you do, Emily Galvin-Almanza. I'm Anthony Davis. Please subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5-Minute News Daily podcast, which drops every morning so you can listen while you make your coffee. Join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5-Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.